director of the center here and member of the faculty in anthropology as well. And really delighted to have you all here today on this cloudy, soupy day. Welcome to fall in California. It's really a huge pleasure to welcome Jeffrey Bussolini here to give today's colloquium talk. Jeff was educated at Georgetown University and at the CUNY Graduate Center, and he also has studied in Paris at the Sorbonne and at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. He grew up, I hope you don't mind my saying this, he grew up in or near Los Alamos, New Mexico, which may have something to do with some of the research he's been doing since 1990, ethnographic and historical research on national security institutions in the large sense, in Los Alamos, New Mexico in particular sense. But Jeff has a really wide range of interests, areas of expertise, and it makes for just an incredibly fascinating research profile. He works on social philosophies of sovereignty and violence, and I think we're going to hear a bit of the intersection between the work on the nuclear stuff and questions of sovereignty here today. But he also works on animal-human interactions, and of course in TV and film studies, of course. All these things come together in a rather extraordinary research enterprise that he has started, which has given me much sort of center envy. So he's the director of the Avenue B Multi-Studies Center in Alphabet City, New York City, which is a center that coordinates research on a number of different areas, but I think the overall sort of thread that connects them is an interest in long-term data-intensive research combined with very fine-grained interpretive theoretical analysis, right? Very nice mix. That's not the only thing that's mixed in that center. Among the work that they do is work on feline studies. So he has a Center for Feline Studies, which is the first center of its kind that conducts non-invasive relational studies on domestic cat social ecology, which is awesome. And the DE students had the chance to speak with Dr. Bussolini today about some of the work he's doing on cat yoga, which sounded very excellent. The center also includes work on the ethnographic and historical study of Los Alamos, Center for Television Studies, and the ethnographic study of Avenue B and the East Village. I think a nice mix of research interests. In addition, Jeff Bussolini is also a scholar of Michel Foucault and Georgio Agamben in the United States, particularly around work on sovereignty, violence, biopolitics, and war. So his publications sort of represent this incredibly interesting trajectory, including the 2010 book, The Culture of National Security Science, Los Alamos and Wen Ho Lee, published by Duke University Press. Several publications on Foucault and Agamben, including ongoing founding events in the work of Carl Schmitt and Georgio Agamben in the journal Telos. And, of course, some very intriguing sounding work on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I can't help but mention. Last, but certainly not least. So it is with this extraordinary profile of expertise, series of interests, and orientations to the world that, that Jeff brings this study of the nuclear state of exception to us today. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Bussolini. Thanks a lot for coming. And in my enthusiasm and my center envy, I forgot to announce that he is associate professor in sociology and anthropology at the CUNY, CUNY Staten Island. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. This
it is. It says it's on. The best I can do. Oh, sorry. Okay. It's for recording. It's not for amplification.
Okay. Does it seem to be working now? Or it's all right?
It doesn't, not supposed to. We won't know.
Oh, okay, all right, okay, all right, okay. That's right. Thank you very much, Corey, and to Sam also for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. And it's always a little bit embarrassing to have such a kind introduction, but I appreciate it very much. And you can probably tell that I'll talk about this a little more in the talk itself, but I have a background, at least in part or substantially, in terms of Chicago school sociological ethnographic methods. So that helps to explain why I'm interested in urban ethnography in terms of the Lower East Side of New York, which has undergone a massive transformation in the last few decades, if you know anything about Alphabet City or Lower East Side. But also, for a long time, I've been using those ethnographic methods to study especially Los Alamos, but also associated places like Lawrence Livermore or Lawrence Berkeley, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and other kind of far-flung aspects of this diaspora of the U.S. security state, these different institutions that are spread around the country. It's a particular pleasure to be able to speak about this here because the University of California in general, and Berkeley in particular, has by far the strongest and longest lasting tie to weapons production of any university in the United States. And I know that that also has been an object of political controversy over the years in the UC, people trying to maybe promote a severing of the weapons labs from the auspices of the University of California. But since 1943, Los Alamos and then later Livermore, when it opened, was operated by the University of California, so that all of the employees of Los Alamos and Livermore were employees of the University of California, even though they were carrying out secret weapons research. Within the recent years, there has been kind of a transformation in the contracts so that University of California is still one of the actors, but it's been changed so that it's on more of an explicit business footing in terms of the contract to run Livermore and Los Alamos, so that other big organizations like Washington Group International or Bechtel have gotten a slice of the pie, but UC is still part of the picture. And like Corey said, I grew up in Los Alamos, and so the UC always loomed large in our imagination there because everyone worked for the University of California, but also we could go to UC for in-state tuition, even though we're from New Mexico. So many of my friends came to Berkeley or UCLA, and when I look back on things, I often regret going to Georgetown instead of Berkeley. Georgetown was okay in many ways, but I didn't quite have all the information I needed at that time to make an informed decision. All right, so anyway, and I understand, by the way, that Oppenheimer himself taught or met in this very room, and so strode on this very, very floor here, and that's really exciting because there's something of a hero worship of Oppenheimer in Los Alamos. And for the most part in Los Alamos, people worship him because of his technical acumen and his role in developing the bomb. But then a few of us also, I think, respect him for his later, more critical and more troubled reactions to the development of the bomb, which aren't always lauded or chronicled as much as his early father of the bomb status. All right, so today I'm going to talk about something that I call the nuclear state of exception. And basically this is an idea that I didn't make up, but that Georgio Agamben and Clinton Rossiter and others just claim outright that the state of exception, the history of which I will discuss here in terms of some of the major literature about it, became a permanent condition when nuclear weapons were developed. There's a long-standing notion that the state of exception is tied to forms of warfare and forms of military technology. And so I think that there's some very convincing reasons for saying that when atomic bombs were invented and they changed the possible conduct of warfare, that it was no longer possible for states to step back from a military footing or to step back from a war footing. But we'll look at that in more detail in this paper. There's a couple major sections. I talk about some theoretical background of the state of exception and then historical background of the state of exception, going back to the Roman Republic, which is kind of the legal initiation point of the doctrine that's then been refigured or transformed over time in different situations in different states. And then I talk about more modern transformations of the state of exception. One of the things I highlight here too is the relation between the state of exception militarily and economic life, which is something that runs right through the tradition about the state of exception, starting from Livy and right up into the 20th century. And I'll highlight an important difference in the economic life vis-a-vis the state of exception in the ancient formulation versus the modern formulation. All right, to start off with epigraph from Heraclitus of Ephesus, who it's hard not to be drawn to in a number of ways, a lot of pithy quotations. And he said, Polymos panton men pater este, panton de Basileus, kai tus men theos edexe, tus de anthropus, tus men doulos epoise, tus de eleutheros, which is often translated as war is the father of all things and king of all. Some it shows as gods, others as humans. Some it makes into slaves, others it makes free. And I think that there's a lot about that thought in Heraclitus that bears on the contemporary state of warfare in the nuclear age. Now, before I really dive into it, I should say, too, that on the one hand, here, when I speak about nuclear weapons, it's a little bit of a shorthand, like nuclear weapons standing in for weapons of mass destruction more generally, biological weapons, chemical weapons. But on the other hand, there is also kind of a specificity to nuclear weapons in terms of this exceptional thinking. And there's a simple kind of litmus test we can see for this. Iran already possesses chemical and biological weapons, but not nuclear weapons. Yet, there's a major concern about Iran obtaining nuclear weapons. So it goes to show that even though sometimes these types of weapons are lumped together, there is an important specificity to the type of power and maybe the historical resonance of nuclear weapons. So this paper addresses historically, theoretically, and ethnographically significant changes in state structure and particularly state emergency powers since the advent of the nuclear age. Several key considerations of the contemporary state of exception consider nuclear weapons as a crucial or necessary cause of increased and less limited state discretionary powers. These are especially executive powers within constitutional democratic governments. The state of exception has little meaning in despotic or totalitarian regimes since, as Clinton Rossiter notes, it is unnecessary to suspend rights that do not exist or to augment powers that are already absolute. As such, the state of exception is a creature of democratic nations, but a peculiar one in that it entails the circumscription, setting aside, or outright supplanting of democratic procedures. No wonder that Georgio Agamben and a long line of legal and jurisprudential literature before him consider the tension inherent in this form of government, since it is both said to be crucial for the maintenance of democracy in instances of crisis, and thus within the prescribed democratic institutions, and also said to be outside of the written and specified forms of democratic government, since it inevitably suspends or disregards protections and limits that in other times are the very definition of a democratic regime. That's why Agamben calls it a zone of indistinction. I think it's both of these. Although recently popular once again, like in Agamben, this thorny question and the issues that surround it are hardly new. They were first decisively presented in the Roman Republic, and all discussions of the phenomenon inevitably start there in one way or another. These problems reemerged in a different form in the liberal era of the late 18th century, when the establishment of the French and American republics in the aftermath of violent revolutions orbited in part around the very same questions of executive power, limitation of state power, checks and balances, and the like. Both of the new republics, born of armed insurrection, were faced with the problem of future armed actions which could threaten their very existence, the preeminent causes being war, like external invasion, or rebellion, internal insurrection. The impetus on the preservation and maintenance of the state, one of the extant meanings of the concept of raison d'état, or reason of state, in the literature, gave rise to measures that would allow a strong and decisive response to threat, even if this would entail the suspension of normal democratic government. Since then, the debate has been about what powers are appropriate and how best to distribute them and limit them in order to prevent the clear danger of these powers being used to subvert democratic government altogether. It is important to note that the theory and the practice of the state of exception center clearly around war and armed threat to a republic. As such, changes in the technologies and modality of warfare have in turn changed the thought and legal structure of the state of exception. As we shall have cause to see below, the two great wars of the 20th century substantially redefined this issue, which, it seems, was permanently altered in the nuclear age. A further complication is introduced in attempting to come to terms with the relation of states of exception to economic processes. Originally, a state of exception meant the cessation of all normal economic activity, or later, the commandeering of industry and the business realm by the state. Now, neither of these seems so certain, or perhaps the relation of the state and economic life has changed in a way which also changes the conduct of economic life under a state of exception. If a state of exception is to be permanent, then clearly the cessation of all normal business activity is not possible, as that, in turn, would cause another threat to the state itself. In part, this paper will also seek to examine the changed relationship between states of exception and economic life. A brief word about the literature is in order here. Agamben, of course, has recently brought this term and issue to the fore, but Agamben, in turn, is drawing heavily on two different sources. One is a 2000 book of the same name, L'État d'Exception, by François Saint-Bonnet, who's on the law faculty at Poitiers. Sambonnet's book is a more comprehensive legal history of the concept, but he is concerned with the same issues, namely abuse of power and threat to democracy. He cites Agamben's 1995 Homo Sacer, but Sambonnet is more concerned to give a comprehensive history of the state of exception in European law, including its contemporary significance and controversies, especially in France. Clinton Rossiter's 1948 Constitutional Dictatorship is an American classic in the field and is cited by both Sambonnet and Agamben. In fact, if you look at Rossiter and Agamben side by side, it's clear that Agamben very heavily works off of Rossiter in terms of his kind of historical sketch of the state of exception, and especially in terms of this claim of nuclear weapons making the state of exception permanent. Rossiter, who devotes chapters or sections to the Roman, German, French, British, and American experiences, is clearly preoccupied by the lasting effects of these crisis periods and especially the role of the atomic age and the bomb in forever altering the use of emergency powers. Each of the above authors also cites Carl Schmitt. Interestingly, Sambonnet and Rossiter seem to regard Schmitt as particularly foolish and dangerous addition to the literature on the state of exception. Curious then, the huge upsurge in not always critical discussion of Schmitt in recent years, even among so-called good liberals, which I guess in a way we could say that Schmitt was himself. Herbert Tingston's, that's a little bit unfair, but Herbert Tingston's Les Pleins Pouvoirs, or Full Powers, is clearly an important contribution to the topic, and it's often cited by these sources that I've just mentioned. Unfortunately, it's extremely hard to locate, having never been translated into English from Swedish, and having been translated into French only in 1934, making surviving copies very rare. This group of authors also represents only a small fraction of the total literature on the topic, which is vast and extends into several fields, especially jurisprudence and political theory. There are a number of books and articles on this and related topics that simply go beyond the scope of this paper for now. In addition, there are a number of related terms and concepts which are part of the literature on states of exception, among them necessity, state of necessity, law of necessity, opportunity, state of emergency, military power, martial law, constitutional dictatorship, state of siege, plein pouvoir, exceptional circumstances, and the like. Some of these have consistent meanings in discussions, while others are subject to differing interpretations and different legal forms in practice. For instance, the state of siege, or l'état de siège, which may only be called by the legislature in some contexts, or only by the executive in other contexts. So sometimes there's specificity to these terms, sometimes there's specificity to these terms within particular national or linguistic contexts, and sometimes there's no real specificity to the terms. They change a lot over time. This paper will have opportunity to consider some of these, but limitations of time and space will prevent an exhaustive consideration of them all, not to mention the lack of any extended training in law and jurisprudence on my part, which makes it difficult to really attend to a lot of the details. In the extant literature, these terms are sometimes used very specifically to refer to specific laws or national contexts, like I said, and in other cases they're used more interchangeably. Some scholars, such as François Sambonnet, and in a different fashion Clinton Rossiter, discuss a general difference in legal theory and interpretation, the German and French schools of thought and law on the matter, over whether these powers, exceptional powers, are necessary precursors and protectors of the state, and thus necessarily outside of the written context of government, which is the German view, or on the other hand, that these special circumstances should be predicted, as far as possible, specified and limited within the constitutional structure itself. So one view is that exceptional powers are always outside of the explicit written text of the Constitution because they're a precursor to the Constitution. The other view is that it's dangerous if you leave exceptional powers that way, and they must be specified within the constitutional documents themselves. Agamben is noteworthy for arguing that for all intents and purposes, both of these are true. The state has and exercises extra-constitutional powers of exception, but they are also largely allowed for according to the modern constitutional forms of government. These powers are both outside of and internal to the political order, thus forming the zone of indistinction that he frequently refers to. Preliminarily, one of the implications of this analysis may be to show that the state of U.S. democracy is far worse than we usually think. Although I guess nowadays, the debates and the election and all that, we might think it's pretty dire already. But perhaps that in some respects it is a democracy in name only, while crucial aspects of public life and action have been decisively claimed by parts of the government acting often secretly with wide grants of authority that also hover between the written provisions of democratic government and the naked exercise of power. The privatization of military and security functions, not to mention the kind of process that I described here, by which the University of California has been heavily tied into weapons production, only makes this boundary all the more uncertain. All right, so now let's talk about the Roman state of exception, which is characterized by total mobilization of the society, but also strict controls and limits. All discussions of the state of exception begin with or draw upon the history of the Roman Republic, which is generally credited with originating the institution as we know it. This may seem like an odd historical anachronism, but given the number of explicit citations of the Romans by later lawmakers drafting constitutions or by legal theorists writing articles, it would seem that the link is more than a cosmetic one. The tremendous administrative and legal inertia of the Roman system throughout European law has guaranteed that this particular element of it would perennially be an issue, even if it was subject to different takes over time. If it is felt so strongly that there is a living tie to the Roman system, as there often is within certain legal jurisdictional systems in Europe, then by virtue of this belief alone, there is one, at least on the performative level, that the Roman example is always being brought up again and referred to. There are, however, significant differences between the current state of exception and its Roman roots. Beyond that, any government seeking to harmonize the extreme force needed to deal with extraordinary crises with the maintenance of democratic institutions has faced a similar question as the Romans. In these senses, the Roman example remains an instructive one for us to look at. The most salient feature of the Roman institution of emergency government, which they called the iustitium, is its limitation. It was clearly understood and stipulated that this institution would be a temporary one, and it was expected that the dictator would step down as soon as the crisis had successfully been met. A dictator could be found culpable and punished, even executed, for actions while in office, including protracting the office beyond the actual cessation of the crisis after he stepped down. Imagine for a moment what effect this single stipulation would have on the widespread use of United States presidential powers if the president could be prosecuted after being in office for overstepping administrative boundaries or emergency powers boundaries. Clearly, we don't have that kind of in theory, we have that kind of a system, but in practice, we don't. In any event, the Roman institution was limited by public sentiment that the dictatorship only extend as long as the crisis, and it was strictly limited at 6 months in any event, no matter what. On the other hand, as this structure was meant only to be invoked in situations of grave mortal danger to the city, the dictator's powers under it were extensive and near total, as he may well have to marshal the resources of the entire city effectively to defend it. As such, this iustitium was a total mobilization of the city, and Rossiter points out that the dictatorship was primarily a military office instituted to save the state from the threat of foreign or rebellious arms, but the power of the dictator extended out from the army in its camp and embraced the entire state. The resort to dictatorship converted the remote Roman Republic and its complex constitution into the simplest and most absolute of all governments, the armed camp governed by the independent and irresponsible general. That's all from Rossiter. This situation of emergency converted the city into one mobilized and armed camp. It seems likely that this aspect of the camp also relates in some way to Agamben's use and analysis of the camp figure, although he primarily discusses the organization and dynamics of the concentration camp in Homo Sacer and in the remnants of Auschwitz, Quelques restes de Auschwitz. Especially given the larger context of Michel Foucault's biopower and biopolitics that Agamben says he would like to address, it seems likely that he also means to refer to Foucault's discussion of the organization and regimentation of the military camp in, among other places, discipline and punish. From this vantage, the city in the state of exceptional mobilization, where normal law is suspended, according to Agamben in state of exception, resembles the legal void of the concentration camp. And I'm talking here, you probably recall that section from Discipline and Punish when Foucault talks about the physical layout and the measures of control within the military camp, the way the tents are laid out and the latrines and all that stuff. All right, so the quote from Agamben, when Agamben's theory of the camp, Agamben's thinking about the camp, he says, this involved, namely, a suspension not only of the administration of justice, but of civil rights as such. It is the sense of this paradoxical juridical institution, which consists solely of the production of a juridical void, that needs to be examined here from a public rights study perspective as much as from a philosophical political one. For Agamben, the iustitium served especially by making the entire society an armed military camp in a time of war, radically to redefine the legal structure and to all but remove democratic measures. Civil rights were drastically curtailed. The usually active advisory and checking functions of the Senate were greatly reduced. The dictator gained the power to try all criminal offenses against the public order and safety, which could be a sweeping category. Sounds like the military tribunals, doesn't it? And also the dictator gained the power to execute summarily or to impose other sentences. The dictator also was granted an expanded power of arrest that could not be gainsaid by the tribunes or by the courts. And something which may be of particular interest to us in the current American context, the dictator could coin money, take the highest auspices, and freely dispose of booty and honors. In addition, while not formally gaining the legislative power, the dictator was given the clear power of the ius edicendi, decrees which were treated as laws during his reign. So a kind of discretionary rule or rule by decree. It will be profitable to study such decrees in comparison with American executive orders at a later date. I haven't had the opportunity to do that, but I think that there's a kind of a vital tie there that probably other scholars have looked at. One vital aspect of the Roman iustitium that must needs be noted is the fact that it entailed the general cessation of all public business. As Livy put it in describing the action of the consul Quinctius when responding to the imminent invasion of the city by the Aquii, he said, "He then convened the Senate and with their backing proclaimed an iustitium, a general suspension of all public business. After that he marched out to defend the frontier, leaving Quintius Servilis as city prefect. But he encountered none of the enemy in the field. The other consul campaigned with great success. Knowing the route the enemy would take, he fell upon them when they were weighed down with their plunder that they had seized in the raid of the city. Few of them escaped the ambush, and all the plunder was recovered. So the iustitium, which had lasted 4 days, was ended upon the return of the consul Quinctius to the city." So in this instance, two important things. One, all general public business was ceased during the time of the state of exception. And second, it only lasted 4 days. So after the threat was met, the consul came back, they suspended the state of exception, returned to business as usual. That this precise situation did not involve the appointment of a dictator and was handled by the normal consuls need not really concern us here. The iustitium is the instrument of dictatorship, and if a dictator was not formally appointed, perhaps because of the swiftness of the Aquian advance on the city, the two consuls were in effect made dictators by the iustitium, which concluded at the end of the 4-day campaign. Not only do we see that the iustitium was strictly limited in time, we also learn from Foster's errata, Foster's the translator of the Loeb edition of this Livy, that, quote, "the iustitium also involved the closing of shops and a general suspension of public business." This point is crucial for us here. In the Roman state of exception, normal economic as well as administrative life was suspended altogether as the city was totally mobilized. The suspension of business and public life is one of the reasons that Agamben argues that the iustitium dissolved all meaningful boundaries of public and private, because private space is immediately neutralized and the consistency of public space becomes uncertain. In the modern US states of exception in the 21st century, following largely on the total war states of exception of the 20th century, it is imperative that economic activity continue in as uninterrupted a fashion as possible. So there's a major difference between the Roman historical precursor and nowadays. Next section of the paper is to look at the total wars of the 20th century, which entailed an augmentation of state power and the explicit emergence of dictatorship. All contemporary commentators on the state of exception readily agree that the experience of total war in the 20th century sharply changed and intensified the institution and the status of states of exception, adding to the severity of both the crises which legitimate them and the powers enacted. If the dusty historical origins of this political institution concern most directly the threat to the city either by foreign invasion and conquer or by internal uprising, the massive industrialized wars between the nation states that rent the first half of the last century could not help but further alter this calculation. There is a particular problem here since, as Justice Wiley Rutledge of the Supreme Court noted, war is a contradiction of all that democracy implies. War is not and cannot be democratic. So there's this legalistic problem of trying to have a democratic lawmaking which bears on war fighting or fighting wars. The state of exception is a state of war, but war is a state that is antithetical to democracy. This is the vexing situation into which we have been thrown, contemporary state of frame of reference. Fully mechanized nations with industrial production and the use of technical developments in transport and weapons confronted each other in ways that magnified the scale of killing tremendously. Also, the speed of forces, as in Blitzkrieg, and the long striking distance of aircraft brought general populations into danger in a new way. Certainly, as the name in the medieval history of the état de siège, the state of siege, shows, attack and war upon the general civilian population was nothing new. However, the technologies and strategies of warfare adopted in the great wars of the 20th century resulted in a different and intensified targeting of civilian populations. Saint-Bonnet clarifies the medieval sense of the state of exception in a way that helps us to see the connection to more recent times. He says, from the 12th century, the imperative of the conservation of the community appeared. From then, an art, a science, a specific logic had to allow the power for the preservation of the king and the realm. However, it can often happen that in cases of danger, the interests of the community enter into manifest contradiction with the ratio status of normal times. These situations concern defense in the large sense of the term. To pass from the normal conduct of the community to its safeguarding in case of danger, necessitas is involved. This is this famous legal doctrine of necessity that supposedly overwrites the law or even makes its own law. And if the old roots of the state of siege and military control have to do with meeting desperate threats to the community, the society, and the nation itself, then the threats of the early 20th century are of the gravest possible sort. The old argument of necessity remains a powerful one, implying fate, that there is no other choice, and that survival demands an extraordinary course of action. It is, in any event, the dangers to the community as a whole and to the realm itself that merit this kind of defense and that are the grounds on which necessity claims can be made. World War I returned these issues with a vengeance. Rossiter notes that as Germany was an empire outright during the war, it is not appropriate to consider it a constitutional dictatorship. It was a dictatorship, yes, but constitutional, no. France during the First World War was, according to Rossiter, an excellent model of the use of emergency constitutional powers with a minimum of abuse and lasting deleterious consequences. Although, in this case too, as in all instances of such emergency constitutional power, he believes that permanent changes toward the more authoritarian were introduced. They couldn't be ratcheted back. By and large, though, Rossiter believes that the French government conducted itself in a way that allowed it to meet the threat of the war while avoiding a serious, lasting compromise of democracy. Key to this was the maintenance of strong legislative oversight and decision-making, demonstrating the proper sense of when to allow wider discretion to the executive, as when the Germans early menaced Paris and it was placed under a state of siege and military command, and when to exert more control, as in resisting cabinet decisions or sending several cabinets packing. All right, so during the war, during World War I, there was kind of a back and forth within the French government in which there was still some of the normal democratic control and normal oversight by elected officials or the cabinet. And then other times when there's a greater sense of urgency and there was more of a sense of state of siege. Also, and crucially, the legislature remained in session for most of the war, not meeting only at times of the greatest crisis or for short intervals. Due to this, Saint-Bonnet believes that the legislative function was served and it produced an effective check which tempered the abuse of power during the war. But as noted, despite positive aspects of French government during the First World War, there are also a number of reservations concerning the impact of that war and its new forms of brutal killing on the ongoing history of the state of siege. As noted by Saint-Bonnet, necessity in law, the notion that necessity makes law or compels action, was one of the strongest and most absolute justifications for the state of exception. It is precisely along these lines that he sees some of the most significant and dangerous developments of the First World War. He says, the First World War is a new point of departure for reflection on the state of necessity in France. Immediately, the question touched on its legality, on the right of necessity. The differences of estimation stumble on the questions of the right of the state. Although it affects jurisprudence as well, it is in doctrine that one finds the best theoretical expressions. The line of demarcation is clear. Certain authors think the necessity belongs to the legal field, others that it must be excluded from it. That's all from Saint-Bonnet, and it goes to this ancient debate about whether necessity, like crisis, invasion, automatically entails a legal status or whether there's some other kind of intermediate or explicit democratic formulation that must be invoked. Saint-Bonnet refers to the longstanding controversy over the legal source of extraordinary powers, from within or outside the explicit legal structure. The usual French interpretation had been that they must be defined, specified, and limited within the constitutional structure, that it didn't make sense, and that it was extremely dangerous to speak of such rights and powers outside of the legal structure. The doctrine of necessity is a particularly forceful attack upon the strong constitutional model, as it is, in effect, as many commentators point out, making necessity itself into a law and overriding the usually usual written law. He gives necessity a force of law that is even more urgent than the rest of the system of laws and rights, and it is presented as their ultimate defender. Certainly this recalls the arguments of the social contract theorists and their discussions of the status of fundamental human rights in relation to threats of life or to the state itself. Rossiter and Saint-Bonnet both point out that Rousseau placed a strong emphasis on the survival of the state, even though we know that in other ways Rousseau emphasized individual liberty. Saint-Bonnet saw danger in the First World War legal interpretations which introduced and furthered the doctrine of necessity as a strong principle. Although it may not have affected the actions of the government in maintaining strong legislative control, he saw other wheels in motion behind that. He cites an interpretation according to a legal scholar named Robert Horney, who said, or according to Saint-Bonnet, he said, Horney believes that the right of necessity is a natural right of the state. In addition, the exercise of a right of necessity does not need to be mentioned in advance by the Constitution to be possible and legitimate. It is justified by the circumstances themselves, which give birth to a new right, the severity of which takes precedence over all existing rights. There are not lacunae in the Constitution in the sense that such a provision would only confirm a right that the state already possesses by the simple fact that it exists. Just like in Schmidt and Agamben, some of the legal reasoning gets awfully convoluted. From what we see here, it seems that the difference between the German and the French approaches to emergency powers were starting to become differences within the French schools of interpretation itself. Saint-Bonnet worries that the war had the effect of pushing and legitimizing this doctrine of necessity, which explicitly supplants the rest of the Constitution. The period following the First World War is important for several reasons. In each country, he considers, Rossiter points out that the decades of the 1920s and 1930s served to add economic depressions and disturbances to the list, war and insurrection, of legitimate causes for the state of siege. And that's one of the major important developments that Rossiter really highlights, and other commentators highlight too, that in the 20th century, economic depression came to be placed side by side with insurrection or external invasion as legitimate causes for adopting a state of exception. Germany, France, the United States, and Britain all had recourse to emergency powers to meet a variety of economic problems. Governments gained the power through this measure to alter taxes, intervene in currency exchange, forbid currency speculation, nationalize industries, put down strikes, and the like. In addition, in some countries, executive legislation acted to bolster employment or add social safety programs. Parts of the New Deal are an example of this. And I don't want to bolster the current Romney BS, but there is a legitimate line of interpretation according to which there is a kind of exceptional or partly totalitarian undercurrent to the way in which part of the New Deal was adopted. Another major turning point in this period was the ill-fated decision by the framers of the German Weimar Constitution to import the imperial state of war into the democratic constitution virtually without change as the notorious Article 48. This provision has been roundly criticized by many, and it was the final measure by which Hitler acted to seize power and put down opposition. Article 48 was problematic because it offered the possibility of extremely broad executive emergency powers with almost no legislative input whatsoever. In a lamentation about this turn of events, Rossiter writes that the question may well be asked, how was it that this democratic assembly should have inserted into this democratic constitution a government device copied from the state of war, one of the most autocratic institutions of the late and unlamented empire? The answer is plainly that Article 48 arose out of the necessity of the time. The vivid memory, this being 1919, of the recent war and the pressure felt for anticipating like conditions again served to underscore the perceived necessity of such unlimited powers. In another variation on the stringent doctrine of necessity, this same pressure, according to Rossiter, also caused the reckless French experience in the lead-up and early days of World War II of overbroad enabling acts that were both unsuccessful and prone to extreme executive abuse, but, according to this line of thinking, the necessity of the times demanded it. With the significant historical precursors just covered, it is little surprise that World War II resulted in such drastic states of exception as it did. With several states having adopted fascism outright, the constitutional democracies felt a tremendous necessity to adopt like measures of stringency in an attempt to meet the threat. Even before the Nazi takeover and collaboration, Rossiter was worried about new moves in French government, largely motivated by the doctrine of necessity, that were compromising democracy. Rossiter spares little emphasis in describing the government of the United States during the Second World War. He says, consider for a moment the government of the United States which piloted the American people through the crisis of the Second World War. And by the way, he was writing in 1948, so it was a really fresh memory for him, I guess. In the successful prosecution of a bitter struggle for survival, the administration at Washington had continuous resort to actions that would have been looked upon as unconstitutional, undemocratic, and downright dictatorial in times of peace. At the very moment when the people of the United States were shouting about the differences between democracy and dictatorship, they were admitting in practice the necessity of conforming their own government more closely to the dictatorial pattern. The wartime inadequacies of their constitutional government were remedied in most instances by an unconscious but nonetheless real imitation of the autocratic methods of their enemies. The danger of meeting fascism for Rossiter is precisely that of needing to imitate it to fight it. He gives a list of unusual and authoritarian practices engaged in by the American government during the war. And as we'll see a bit below, he was significantly worried about the prospects of the US government bouncing back unscathed from this experience. Because as in the earlier French experience, he thought that the adoption of these measures were extremely difficult to roll back once they had been put in place and kind of accepted. He discusses, too, the British experience of cabinet dictatorship and sees similar lasting changes and dangers in that system as well. This quick review indicates that the experience of total wars in the early 20th century served stridently to increase the feeling of necessity for states of exception and almost unbridled emergency powers in certain situations. If war is the sine qua non of the state of exception, then these wars decisively altered the institution and ratcheted up the level of accepted incursions into civil and private life. Charting these transformations sets the stage for the next and conclusive turn of events, the nuclear age. And that's the third part of this paper about the nuclear age, which, according to Agamben and Rossiter, is characterized by a permanent state of exception. Culminating a string of tremendous technical destruction and wanton killing in the Holocaust and firebombing, the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki unleashed a new type of warfare and forever changed the nature of the state of exception. After World War II, there was no doubt that populations were not only a target, but the most decisive and preeminent target in modern strategic warfare. The atomic bombing showed that hundreds of thousands of people could be killed instantly by a single plane or missile. If the destruction and killing of the First World War buttressed the doctrine of necessity and pushed the state of exception toward more scope and depth, it was certain that the experiences of World War II, in their extremity, could only serve as well to increase the imprimatur on this institution. Agamben indicates that this was an important turning point. He says, and he's partly quoting Rossiter here, he says, the fact is that the two criteria of absolute necessity and of temporariness, which refer to the earlier state of exception, to which all the others in the final analysis reduce, contradict, as Rossiter well knows, and that the state of exception has become the rule. And now, Agamben quotes Rossiter, in the atomic era into which the world is now entering, it is likely that the use of emergency constitutional powers will become the rule rather than the exception. And this is an interesting tidbit in Agamben. It's on page 17 in the Italian. I can't remember what page it's on in the English, maybe like 23 or so. And you know, Agamben, because he's so philological, usually he'll bring something up like that, and then he'll have like a big interpretation of it back and forth, kind of contradict it, make it, you know, complexify it. He doesn't do that here. All he does is put the quote in and just leave it. So leads me to believe that he doesn't disagree with the quote. He does, because he doesn't amend it. He doesn't qualify it at all. Just simply states it outright. Agamben quotes Rossiter since this is a fear that Rossiter shares and expresses several times in his book. The qualitative change in warfare resulting in quick and massive destruction of the population or the community, in the older medieval term, made the maintenance of some war footings and extraordinary measures inevitable at all times. The danger of an atomic attack became in some sense the chief preoccupation of every state government. Given that such an attack could come so quickly, so unpredictably, and with such massive damage, some degree of military posture would have to be kept in effect at all times. A government must be vigilant in acting to predict and prevent any such attack, no matter what the cost and expedient measures or restriction of democratic rights. And if such an attack should take place, a strong and efficient government of crisis would need to be in place to respond to the calamity. Not that martial law is going to save us from an atomic attack, still it may be the only glue available when it comes time to pick up the pieces. That's Rossiter again. And you probably all remember the kind of outrageous efforts in the US and other places during the Cold War in civil defense, and these notions that we would have to have like a strong state, but also like an organized populace, the Dr. Strangelove kind of model to be able to survive atomic attack. The urgent threat of atomic attack seems to call out equally urgently for a strong and unlimited government that has the power, resources, and speed necessary to respond to an attack. As Rossiter has it, it is not too much to say that the destiny of this nation in the atomic age will rest on the capacity of the president as an institution of constitutional dictatorship. If the state of exception has always been tied to a threat of war, and if nuclear war in particular seems so threatening to Agamben and Rossiter that it will necessarily call out extreme governmental powers of exception, what is it about this type of warfare that merits this type of response? As noted a bit before, the scale of the atomic bomb, both large in terms of destruction and small in terms of the package in which it is delivered, is part of the reason that it seems to demand an ever more vigilant state. This state would have to be proactive in terms of intelligence and strong in its ability to respond. In discussions about changes in state structure during and after World War II, Harry, interview informant of mine who had experience in intelligence and defense businesses, described to me how a lot of people might not realize it, but many of the agencies and government actions we take for granted now only arose with the war and have really grown since then. In particular, you would have to say this about the intelligence and military parts of the government. Before the war, the U.S. did have intelligence agencies, that is part of statecraft and is as old as the book, but it was much smaller scale than it is now. And most of the agencies and organs that that now exist simply didn't exist then, before the war. During the war, there was a clear need for an intelligence and action organization beyond the scope of what we had. There was a military intelligence organization, of course, that played a role in the war, but there was a need for a more centralized and capable civilian intelligence agency. I was in the OSS during the war, and that's exactly what we did. A lot of it was touch and go then, but we were setting up that new intelligence capability. After the war, with the atrocity that had taken place and the sense of an ongoing threat, many folks in government realized immediately that we could not dismantle our wartime efforts. In that way, the OSS started a transition to becoming the CIA, which would continue and expand the wartime OSS work. I think that foremost on everyone's mind was the threat posed by the new atomic bombs. No nation could afford to get caught with its pants down. We sure as hell didn't want to. And after the experience of 2 huge world wars in short succession, the phrase, "Fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me," comes to mind. The United States might have drawn down a lot after the First World War, but after the Second World War, I don't think that was in the cards. That all comes from Harry. Harry specifies the experience of the world wars and the shocking new power of the bomb as causes of a new stridency in government. The perceived level of threat and the chances of extreme damage in an attack made the nuclear age more dangerous and legitimated a host of new measures of extreme government. The marked increase in secret organizations within the government, functioning under secret orders and often outside of democratic checks and limits, is one of the hallmarks of the permanent state of exception put into place within the U.S. state structure. These organizations embody exactly the paradox pointed to by Rossiter, Agamben, Sambonnet, and others. They are both within and outside of the law. Their reason for existence is to maintain the state and protect the population by whatever means necessary, even those outside of law and outside of the legal structure. But their mission and existence are prescribed and supported within the legal structure of the democratic state. The distinction between domestic and foreign intelligence, as if the power and charter of these foreign espionage agencies ended at the border, is, like the distinction between nuclear weapons and nuclear power, largely a fictive one. Perhaps it was reassuring to think that we enjoyed free, unmolested communication all those years, but no one should have been surprised by the revelations that the National Security Agency was conducting substantial domestic surveillance a few years ago in the aftermath of September 11th. So the expansion of the shadow state and secret government was a major outgrowth of World War II that made the state of exception into an ongoing condition. What aspects of military strategy and force structure contributed to the augmenting and strengthening of the state and its exceptional powers? By closing the time frame for surprise attacks so dramatically, the atomic age ruled out any extreme reduction in forces or capability. Older modes of war and fighting had generally given more lead time. The enemy could often be observed in preparations which gave plenty of time to fortify and produce weapons, or at least the enemy could be spotted on the move, and this would give several days or weeks to mobilize forces. Not so with atomic attack, which could come at any time and thus represented a new kind of fear and anxiety, appropriate to the existentialism of the day. And if any of you know my friend Jackie Orr's book about the Panic Diaries, where she talks about, she really nicely diagnoses this kind of anxiety that's unique to the Cold War. Roy, who had been an Air Force officer, described how he had served in the Strategic Air Command, and he said, "We were essentially trained and operated on the belief that we were at war at all times. We never know from where or how quickly a threat could emerge, and we had to be ready to respond while we still could. There wouldn't be time to declare war or for any kind of deliberation, so we had to be prepared and in position and ready to go at all times. Yeah, in essence, we were always at war, a controlled war that we tried to keep in check through controlling the threat level, but make no mistake, it was treated, it felt like a war, like it could come at any second. In that case, we had to be ready to strike back right away, and that meant that we had to just about be at war already, with our fingers on the trigger, our alert bombers always in the air, our missiles, that was our line of defense." The threat posed by atomic weapons is such that, in effect, the military is required to behave at all times as if it were at war. It goes without saying that such a situation does not leave time for congressional deliberation, a public vote, or even for any considerations of strategy. The atomic age produced a situation in which the only alternative was a heavily militarized infrastructure minutes away from the launch of these weapons. Deliberation or consideration would be a weakness and a luxury in this situation that calls, rather, for an extremely streamlined state of exception that could allow quick action with overwhelming genocidal force. Another former Air Force officer, who had been a high-ranking member of the Defense Nuclear Agency, explained that, from a strategic point of view, there had been times in history when you could avoid a standing army and elaborate preparations because you had advance warning. You would hear that a force was on the move. You would see that those down the coast from you were preparing ships or weapons. And you would have the chance in turn to gather men and troops to put together or produce weapons or fortifications or evacuate part of your population. Not so with nuclear weapons. There was not going to be time to prepare any more munitions or start up the assembly line. We would have to fight not just with what we had at the time, but with what was loaded up, fueled, aimed, and ready to go. That was part of why the Defense Nuclear Agency existed. We had to take care of all kinds of logistics, development, and planning that in former times could have been begun after the war had started. We had to predict and prepare all that before the first shot got off the ground. These three insider accounts, as well as a number of other considerations, indicate that the atomic age produced an immediate and pronounced effect on the state of exception, making it temporally unbound, permanent, more authoritarian, more mobilized, and in effect always at war. The exigency produced by the introduction of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons in World War I and atomic weapons in World War II, pushed the hand of the advocates of necessity and strong government in a way that permanently reshaped constitutional democracies. And now the last section is about the nuclear age and a transformation in geopolitics and biopolitics. And this is where we consider some of those transformations in economics that we were talking about before. Earlier, it was indicated that this paper would try to deal with, at least in a limited extent, with the characteristic relations of the state of exception in economic life. Indeed, that has formed part of the reflections as economic exchange has been affected or controlled through various forms of the state of exception. Here it is germane to revisit the earlier contention that the Roman state of exception in the Justitium entailed the closing of shops and of all public business. In that context, the crisis was felt to be a temporary and urgent condition during which public business and the market were suspended to focus attention on the matters at hand, on the threats at hand. If the nuclear age has given rise to a permanent state of exception and an ongoing state of warfare, then clearly the cessation of business for the duration of this prolonged state of exception is out of the question. Rather, it seems the priority of the atomic age state of exception is the ongoing maintenance and stimulation of the economy as much as possible, and the avoidance of any significant delays or shocks to the economy. Everyone is unfortunately all too familiar with the encouragements quickly given from all levels of government on and after September 11th, according to or in the line of saying something like, shop more, don't stop spending, if you do stop spending, if you stop shopping, then the terrorists will win. This is particularly strong. I mean, it's strong everywhere, but it's particularly strong in New York. You might remember when Giuliani's standing up there and saying this kind of thing. Curious, perhaps, that in a time of national tragedy, no authentic time of national mourning or reflection was encouraged, but rather a blind continuation of participation in the market and consumerist practices. The measures taken to ensure and promote the continuation of market and exchange indicate what a high priority this was. Dave, a computer expert who worked for Merrill Lynch in one of the towers of the World Trade Center, explained how I worked in the towers and was there on that day. I only made it out because I ran down more than 30 flights of stairs. Every stair I kept thinking, oh God, this is going to be it. Oh shit. I made it all the way down and then I ran out. I made it, but I ended up getting a lot of that gray stuff on me, and many people who I knew died. So there I was, alive but scared, worse than I ever had been scared, and sad about my colleagues, about those people that I knew, about what had happened. And those motherfuckers, my bosses, told me that I had to go to work in Jersey City the next day to set up their backup systems. I did it. I went in the next day, but that was the day I decided that I was quitting. Fuck that. Dave's story is shocking. Having narrowly escaped death, he was given no break or recompense at all for it, but rather was brusquely ordered to come in tomorrow to patch things up so that the normal business operations could keep running. Only an extreme emphasis on the maintenance of economic exchange, it seems, would motivate such a measure. His story shows clearly that the contemporary state of exception is not, in this respect, the parallel of the Roman justitium. What is behind the shift from suspension of business to an emphasis instead on the continuation of business at all costs? Perhaps several factors. One is that the economy of the United States is now very heavily integrated with functions of military production. The formal military services and intelligence agencies work frequently with all manner of private firms and businesses, and some of these firms have taken over the functions of government agencies wholesale. Second, the maintenance of a standing army and military force, as opposed to the conscription of all able-bodied individuals in time of crisis, has led to a situation of division of labor in warfare, where the soldiers, spies, and mercenaries carry out the fighting, while the rest of the population is expected to continue the productive process which arms and supports them by shopping and by continuing the normal economic activities. There is, of course, this bizarre ideology that the rest of the nation, ignoring reality and going on spending blindly, somehow represents a moral victory that proves freedom. Beyond these, it seems that other factors as well may be playing a role, factors that once again bear on some of the crucial aspects of the state of exception. These considerations are illuminated by particular passages from Michel Foucault's lecture courses at the Collège de France. Like Rossiter, Agamben, and others, Foucault seemed to realize that the atomic age represented an important historical shift, even if he was unable thoroughly to make out what it was. The nuclear age and nuclear weapons, though, fit in a very particular way into his description and exploration of biopower. He says, "We are therefore in a power that has taken in charge the body and life, or which has taken, if you like, life in general in charge, with the pole on the side of the body and the pole on the side of the population. Biopower, consequently, of which we mark directly the paradoxes appearing at the limits of its exercise. Paradoxes that appear on the one side with atomic power, which is not simply the power to kill, according to the rights that are given to every sovereign, millions and hundreds of millions of people, after all, this is traditional, but that which makes atomic power for the function of contemporary political power a type of paradox difficult to resolve, if not altogether irresolvable, is that with the power to make and use the atomic bomb, there is the putting in play of the power of a sovereignty that kills, also equally with a power which is that of killing life itself, in such a manner that, in this atomic power, the power which is exercised in a manner that is capable of annihilating life, and of annihilating it in consequence as a power of assuring life." It's back to the same kind of paradox that you try to maintain life by killing, or you must kill to maintain life. All right, and the last quotation from Foucault, or maybe penultimate, but this is probably a good last quotation. He's describing the precursors of biopower and biopolitics in the Nazi state. And the reason I draw on Foucault here is you might recall that in his kind of genealogy of biopower and then biopolitics, he points to both the Nazi state and the atomic bomb as crucial precursors, and that you couldn't have the development in biopolitics without these historical precursors. Describing Nazi Germany, he says that it was characterized by the emphasis on final solution for the other races, but absolute suicide for the German race. It is to this that the mechanic or the mechanism inscribed in the functioning of the modern state leads. Only Nazism, of course, pushed the game between the sovereign right to kill and the mechanisms of biopower to the point of paroxysm. But this game is inscribed effectively in the functioning of all states, of all modern states, of all capitalist states. So I think some of this analysis of the state of exception and what happened with the development of nuclear weapons kind of bears out what Foucault said, that there was like absolute suicide of the population is the basic bargaining chip or kind of fundamental presumption of the development of nuclear weapons. All right, and okay, I said that was last, but one last quotation because he brings it back also to the relation to liberalism and neoliberalism. And he says, when he's also talking about this biopolitics that's built on the genealogical precursor of the Nazi state and the atomic bomb, he says, then it is to the level of founding and legitimating principle of the state that liberalism was brought. It is not the state which self-limits through liberalism, it is the exigence of liberalism which becomes founder of the state. This, I believe, is one of the traits of American liberalism. This, I think, also helps to account for why there's such an emphasis on the maintenance of economic practice. It is liberalism, or it's the continual operation of economic liberalism and the market that is supposed to create state power. So whereas earlier, state power, like in the Justitium, was seen as something which would act to protect the economic sphere, and the economic sphere would be suspended in order that the integrity of the society could be protected, and then economic activity could be resumed. What Foucault is describing in modern frame of reference is that the legitimacy and the sovereignty of the state itself emerges, is generated by economic activity. So there's never a pretense, so there's never a cause to suspend economic activity, and there's a premium instead on maintaining economic activity at all times, even at the height of the state of exception. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you being here.